This video walkthrough is to help you with the labeling of the diagram for the nephron, which is on page 296 in your notebook. When we first look at the nephron, this diagram can seem a little overwhelming and very confusing. There's really two segments to it that we need to consider. One is a blood supply, which we see coming up the side and then wrapping throughout it. And the second is a set of tubing which coils back and forth on itself and then eventually leaves through a collecting tube. Let's look at this a little bit separate before we start to label things. Okay, right here, I've set up that I've deleted out all of the tubing. So right here, we only see the blood supply, and that simplifies the diagram a little bit more. Now on the right-hand side here, we've put it all back in, but color-coded it so that we see that number 8, number 6, number 4 are all red. They're coming in, exiting, and we can see there's little arrows on our diagram here to show entering and exiting. And then it branches into a series of capillaries that cling to all this tubing. And all the ones here that are red are the arteries, and then the blue here is the veins. So coming back out, 5, 7, and 9 are draining it. And that shows us the blood supply. We're going to come back to the blood supply in a minute. But let's look at this collecting set of tubes here first. So now, looking at just the tubing with the blood supply removed, we can see that there is a capsule here, and this is called Bowman's capsule or the glomerular capsule because the ball of capillaries that's inside it is called the glomerulus. And then if we look at it, we see that it comes up. We'll just kind of follow it here. Goes down. There's a little corkscrew here, and then it plunges down, turns back upward sharply, and then we follow it around here. And you can kind of trace that with a colored pencil and see where it goes. And then we end up in this collecting tube again. So on this side, I've broken it up into the segments that we're going to end up labeling in just a moment. So right here we see the capsule in green. Now this first tube is all sort of twisted up or convoluted. So they call it a convoluted tubule. And so we also see the purple one is sort of twisted up or convoluted. It is also a convoluted tubule. The way that we tell these apart is by using the word proximal or distal. So proximal is closest to point of attachment. So in this case, the point of reference is the glomerular capsule, where all the filtration of the blood is beginning. So this first one is the proximal convoluted tubule. And then when it goes down to the bottom, this hairpin turn here, or this really sharp turn, is called the loop of Henle. And now the rest of that tubule, which is farther from the point of attachment, is the distal convoluted tubule. You'll also see these commonly abbreviated as PCT for proximal convoluted tubule and DCT for distal convoluted tubule. Finally, that is going to empty into something called the collecting duct. Ultimately, this collecting duct is going to get the urine that's being produced out of the kidney to a ureter, from a ureter to the urinary bladder where it's stored. From there, it'll leave the body through the urethra. So this is one of the little tubules that's going to eventually help it get out of the kidney. We see these little side pieces that have been cut off here. This is where another nephron would plug into it. So one collecting duct will drain urine from several of these nephrons. So let's go back and now kind of put this all together and label it. So here is our original diagram again, and we're ready to start labeling it. I've color-coded it to make it a little bit easier to see what we're pointing at. Remember what the nephron is doing. It's taking blood in, it is filtering substances out of the blood, which are going to be collected in this tubule. And that tubule is eventually going to lead to this collecting duct over here in purple, which will then take that urine out of the body. Then this blood is going to return into circulation over here. So what is happening in this capsule is filtration. It's under such high pressure that it forces about 99% of the solutes that are in the blood out of the blood. The problem with that is not only does it force the bad things out that we want to get rid of, basically the metabolic waste that is in our blood, it also gets rid of good things like glucose and water and amino acids and ions. So part of this process here with these tubules is going to be recollecting some of those good things and getting them back into the blood. Now, let's start labeling some of these things. And let's take care of the blood supply that's over here. So here on the right-hand side, I put a reference for you. We know that all blood is leaving the heart through the aorta. Eventually, it's going to get into a kidney through a renal artery. And then there's several branches getting smaller and smaller until we get down to the size of a glomerulus. In order from big to small, they go segmental arteries, interlobar arteries, arcuate arteries, cortical radiate arteries, and now we're into the glomerulus. There are actually some other ones in here that they're leaving off of the list, but these are the major ones in order. So when we look over here at the red artery, for example, we see number 8 is a big one. Number 5 is a little bit smaller. Number 4 is smaller still. And then number 2 is feeding it into the glomerulus. And number 3 is taking it out of the glomerulus. So really we have to deal with 1, 2, 3 of the final blood vessels before they get into the glomerular capsule. So those 3 are called interlobar, arcuate, and cortical radiate. So let's add those in now in order. So we're going to start down here with number 8 because that is the largest one. So that one is an interlobar artery. Okay, let's move up to number 5. So the next one here is arcuate. So this is the arcuate artery. You should also see those in a word bank underneath your diagram. I've deleted it just to make this a little bit simpler looking. And then this last one, before it's going to get into that glomerulus, is a cortical radiate artery. So cortical radiate artery. Now that we have those first 3 started, we have the same thing happening for the veins here. So they have the same names, except they're called veins. So the large one is interlobar vein this time. The next one that's sort of running side to side here is an arcuate vein. And finally, the cortical radiate vein. Okay, so let me zoom in on those a little bit because we've been out here. We'll take a little bit better look. Okay, so just making sure that we're clear here. 4 is cortical radiate artery. 5 is cortical radiate vein. 6 is arcuate artery. 7 is arcuate vein. 8 is interlobar artery. 9 is interlobar vein. So now let's kind of come up into the blood supply in this area. We see that number 2 is coming into the glomerulus, and number 3 is leaving it. This is one of those rare times where an artery both goes into and out of a structure. Usually it's an artery in and a vein out. In this case, it's artery in, artery out. So when we have to do that, we have to distinguish them from each other. So number 2 is going to be the afferent, in other words, approaching the arteriole, meaning small artery. And then number 3 is exiting it, or going away from it, so that is the efferent arteriole. And you should be familiar with those terms afferent and efferent from the nervous system. Now let's kind of go up here for a minute to number 15. That's pointing to this ball of capillaries here that are under high pressure. And so this is where the filtration is occurring. This is the glomerulus. And then number 14 is trying to point to all of these capillaries. So it's only pointing to a couple here, but it's really referring to all the capillaries that wrap this entire set of tubing. And that is the peritubular capillaries. And why peritubular? Remember, peri means surrounding, and they're surrounding the tubules, so peritubular. Now, that is the blood supply. So what is left is what we discussed earlier. We just need to formally label it now, of where we're going to initially start doing the filtering, number 1. So this is sometimes called Bowman's capsule. It's also called the glomerular capsule. Then, what's the first thing that comes off of it? We have this tube here in yellow. So as I follow it around, all of a sudden, right here, number 13 is what's pointing to it. So we want that one to be the proximal, for being the closest to the Bowman's capsule, convoluted tubule. Now we follow the proximal convoluted tubule around, and we're going down now, down, 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 down. Here's where we have that hairpin turn. That turn is the loop of Henle. Now it's coming up in green, and we're just looking as we follow it for a labeling marker. Oh, here it is. Number 12 is pointing to this part here that we've colored in green. That is the distal convoluted tubule. And then the distal convoluted tubule dumps into this one in purple, which again, lots of different nephrons could be plugged into this one. But just to label it, this is a collecting duct. So just taking a look at how this fits into your notes in some of the physiology, nephrons are the functional unit of the kidney, and you have millions of them. And let's just zoom out here for a minute and take a look at it again. Okay. The first phase of filtration is blood coming into the glomerulus. That is non-selective, so it is filtering a lot of things out based on pressure, but it's filtering out the good and the bad. Almost immediately in the proximal convoluted tubule, we're doing something called tubular reabsorption. And what's happening right now is, even though in this tube there's some waste that we're trying to get rid of, there's also lots of good stuff. So in this area, this is where we're reabsorbing water, sugar, amino acids, and ions. And that's what these peritubular capillaries are doing. They're clinging to this tube and they're reabsorbing the good stuff. And that's going to eventually get that good stuff back into the blood so I can distribute it throughout my body. The loop of Henle turns here, and now we're really talking about the distal convoluted tubule, and this does something called tubular secretion. Even though we did some filtration here. We're still trying to get rid of some more things that are still in the blood that might be harmful. This could be things such as certain drugs. Creatine is often found in this, sometimes potassium. And what we're doing is actually putting that from the blood supply here yet finally into this tube as one last method of getting rid of waste. And the final waste gets into the collecting duct, and from here it ultimately leaves the kidney.